Now I will pass it over to WSBR's President, Courtney Stad.
Hi, thank you very much, Sonny, and welcome to what I'm absolutely convinced is going to be a very interesting and compelling, if not provocative, hour regarding what is in store for our space industry in the coming months. Can't imagine a better set of experts to look through their respective crystal balls. And I can't imagine, as part of the WSBR family, a better moderator than Alex Clotrup, who is an official with Starship Space, which has an operating satellite and focused on satellite servicing. She works on the business development and part of the company. And for our purposes, she's co-chair of our programs committee, along with Chris Hunstadler. And we thank Chris and Alex very much for today's forum. So with that, let me turn the baton over to Alex. And at the end, I'll have a couple of concluding remarks, including our upcoming event on February 4th. So with that, Alex, you're on.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you, Sonny and Courtney, for getting us set up. And thank you, everyone, for attending today. I saw we had almost 200 people registered. With virtual events, you never know, but it looks like some pretty good attendance. As you may know, Washington Space Business Roundtable, we are a nonprofit, and all of our proceeds go to STEM education initiatives here in the National Capital area and beyond. If you ever run into Shiv Patel from our board, he runs all of our education initiative programs, so feel free to reach out to him about that. But for today's free program, as you can see on the screen, we are joined by 4 space journalists who have been thinking quite a bit about the outlook for 2025. We're going to start with a lightning quick round of intros in the order of the screen. So Mikayla first, then Jeff, Theresa, and Joey. If you could share your name and title, your publication, and your special area of focus, if you have one. And I would love to hear a milestone in the commercial space industry that you have your eye on for 2025. So over to you, Mikayla.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. Hello, my name is Mikayla Easley. I'm a reporter for Defense Scoop. I primarily cover the Pentagon's use of emerging technologies, which is a lot of space stuff. And so lots of really cool things that I get to learn about and write about. One milestone in 2025 that I'm looking forward to kind of seeing how it plays out is on the manufacturing side. You know, I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the department's moving towards these very large proliferated constellations that they want on orbit very, very quickly. And so it'll be interesting to see how, you know, companies from both traditional primes or commercial kind of come up with new and innovative ways to meet that demand in terms of like manufacturing techniques.
Very good. Theresa.
Hi, thank you for doing this. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm Theresa Hitchens. I'm the senior space reporter at Breaking Defense. I tend to concentrate on space policy and space governance questions from a national security perspective. But the commercial thing I'm looking forward to in 2025 is the culmination of the first contracts under DoD's, the Space Force's new commercial augmentation space reserve program, the CASR program. They have vowed to have their first contracts up and running sometime early this year. So I'm keeping an eyeball on that and where that program is going to go in potentially providing some kind of stability in defense funding for commercial companies hoping to break into the national security field.
Thanks, Theresa. Let's go over to Jeff.
Hi, I'm Jeff Foust. I'm a senior staff writer at SpaceNews. I focus a lot on civil space like NASA and other civil agencies, as well as a lot of what's going on the commercial space side. You know, I think what I'm really looking forward to this year is something that we're already starting to see happening this year, is that these new launch vehicles are moving out of development into operations. You know, just last Thursday, we saw 2 test flights on the same day of heavy lift rockets, Blue Origin's New Glenn and SpaceX's Starship. And, you know, and this is the year that we expect to see, you know, Blue Origin's New Glenn moving into operations, Starship going through its test program and starting demonstrating the capabilities it needs to go to the moon, as well as Vulcan moving into service along with Ariane 6. So it's going to be a fascinating year that's gotten off to a pretty quick start.
All right, thanks, Jeff. And last but not least, Joey.
Yeah, I'm Joey Roulette. I cover space news for Reuters, which is, both civil, military space and the international relations of space. I try to track as much as I can, but there's so much going on. I'd have to agree with Mikayla and Jeff on what, we're looking forward to this coming year. I think the constellations that are growing is a very important thing to track, and particularly with Amazon's Kuiper, whether they can start launching their batches of satellites before their 2026 deadline is something that I'm looking closely on. And then also the rise of the new launch vehicles, whether New Glenn can launch a second time and kind of get into the beginning of a competitive launch pace with SpaceX. So yeah, I think it's going to be a pretty exciting and busy year.
All right, very good. Well, thank you everyone for the intros. We're going to jump into discussion topics now. Up first, I wanted to touch on the role of space in geopolitics and diplomacy. Joey, I know this topic and the Artemis Accords in particular are of interest to you. As we know, the Artemis Accords started under Trump 1 first term, but they remain a major area of focus under the Biden administration. What can we expect going forward? And do you think that the Artemis Accords are likely to remain a meaningful diplomatic tool in 2025?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, obviously there's a lot of things that are up in the air right now, and it's hard to predict which, political camps are going to win and getting what they want, and as far as space policy. But, if the Trump administration's America First agenda is to, extend to space, which I don't see why it would not, then I think there could be less of a focus on Artemis Accords as a component of NASA's human exploration program and its efforts to court allies. I've talked to a few people who have kind of suggested that and said that we might back away from the Artemis Accords, but of course nothing is set in stone yet. And there's a lot of other people, equal amount of people fighting for its continuation. And I think just this week, another Artemis Accord signatory was added. So it's still continuing. It's mid 50s, 50 something so far. Jeff or
Finland
53 with
Finland.
53.
The big 53, yeah. But I think, it's not just the Artemis Accords that, are of course involved in steering international relations in space. I think, how this administration ties commercial companies, private companies into global diplomacy is going to be interesting. I think, space obviously has always been a major tool for diplomacy that connects countries and, forges bonds in areas that otherwise wouldn't exist. But the rise of commercial operations and activities is kind of, I think, changing that sanctity of space that existed a lot many years ago. And so we'll see, what interests emerge from that. I think constellations like SpaceX's Starlink has, had a very strong diplomatic interest, an international interest, I should say, in getting foreign approvals and regulatory approvals for its constellation. Once Amazon gets into that game, I think things might, also change. But yeah, I think things are going to change, of course, from the Biden administration. And at this point, it remains to be seen exactly how.
I think you raise a good point, Joey, about the interaction between the commercial space actors and private companies in international relations and diplomacy. I think maybe to zoom out, this poses some significant policy questions. And I saw you reported yesterday that National Space Council under the new administration is looking less and less likely. I guess question for the whole panel, what could this mean for the White House's ability to execute or respond to these types of emerging policy questions in 2025?
Well, I think the question is going to be how the White House organizes on space. In the past, before or during times when there wasn't a National Space Council, there was usually the National Security Council as well as OSTP that was involved in space policy. So if the National Space Council doesn't return in this administration, you may see something along those lines. Certainly, there's going to be some organizing element within the White House of space policy. The question is, who are the players and who are making the decisions?
Can I just say that I think a lot of this is at this point probably going to be personality driven. If you don't have a National Space Council that serves as a place for all the different agencies to talk about whole of government approaches, then in general, policy starts to become personality driven if there's no one in particular in charge, right? So of herding cats. So that's going to be the interesting thing to see where those personalities with interest in those issues come to the fore in making policy.
Yeah, and I also, one thing I just want to say is, of course, the Space Council has had a major role in bringing the private sector into, discussions of international space policy. And if, the Trump administration cares about that, then, they might want to keep the Space Council in that regard. Or, there's a billion other things that, the council has to do. But I just wanted to say that, it is an engine of international discussion. So.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. Thank you guys for weighing in there. My next question has to do on the defense side. Theresa, with increasing trend lines for defense end users becoming customers of commercial space products and services rather than potentially owner-operators themselves, what is the budget outlook in 2025 for procurement of these services? I know, as you mentioned, you're interested in commercial integration. Do you feel that the Space Force is equipped to continue moving forward, for instance, on the commercial strategy they introduced last year?
I mean, the budget has always been the big question. Up to now, most of the commercial activities have actually been funded by plus-ups from Congress, not from actual, budget programs that are programs of record. There's a lot of experimentation with commercial operators and everywhere from, from the Space Development Agency, although they're not really using commercial services. Remember, they're giving contracts to commercial companies to kind of create commercially based defense products, right? Which is different from, say, what Kazer's trying to do or what the Commercial Space Office is doing with what has been doing with SATCOM under different names for many, many years, which is sort of serving as an intermediary to buy bandwidth, for example. I know that there's interest in expanding the use of commercial services, which I think most people in the Space Force and even in the intelligence community understand can be a cheaper way of acquiring capabilities, particularly in SATCOM, but also in remote sensing and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. But if you look across the board at spending, the rhetoric has all been out there. We want to use more commercial. We want to, buy what we can, build what we must, whatever catchphrase you want to use to this. You have to put your money where your mouth is. And so far, neither really the intelligence community nor DoD and the Space Force have anteed up real budget funds to create long-term programs that can stabilize the commercial companies that they see as providing baseline services for them down the road. And while DoD has said on many occasions it doesn't want to be an anchor tenant for a number of these technologies, including a lot of ISR, including, say, logistics, space logistics, things like refueling or nuclear propulsion, in space manufacturing, a lot of those things, if DoD is not an anchor tenant, then those industries are not going to thrive, period, because they're funded by venture capitalists, and venture capitalists have a 5-year window to make money or bust, right? And that's not something you can put a national security strategy around. So there's a disconnect right now, and whether or not that's going to be resolved in the 26 budget or under the Trump administration is anybody's guess right now.
Okay. Such an analysis we seldom see. So thank you, Theresa. I want to talk also about, how can government start to bridge these gaps in funding that you've outlined? I know, Jeff, you were talking earlier as we were planning for today about cooperation between different parts of the government, such as NASA with the Space Force. Do you see any areas where this type of cross-pollination might bridge the gaps that Theresa was pointing out in funding, or help bring new capabilities forward from commercial, especially in these venture-funded startups?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's going to be more opportunities for collaboration between the civil and national security sides of space. The question is always going to be, where is the money going to be coming from? To mention, for example, the commercial remote sensing example, NASA has a program where it does buy data from a lot of these companies, but it's relatively small compared to the purchases that are going to be made on the national security space side. So I think a lot of the companies, while they're happy to have NASA's business, are really looking to the NGAs and NROs of the world to help them with the business that they need, to help them really close their business cases in markets where the commercial industry alone is not sufficient to support the number of companies that are out there.
Okay, well, keeping on topic with our defense discussion here, Mikayla, I was reading an article you recently published about supply chain issues in commercial space. You mentioned at the top your interest in this very large constellation that SDA is building, the Proliferated Warfighter Space Architecture, I believe is the PWSA. What particular challenges do you see that commercial providers face in scaling up to meet new demand from defense customers? And
Yeah.
Mikayla,
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think it's the sheer scale with which with the constellations that we're trying to launch now. Like historically, national security space has relied on, a handful of satellites, that take years to build, and, that takes, so there's been time to have a lot of these subcomponents and, things that go into a satellite. And now the rhetoric is we need to get hundreds of these satellites on orbit or on order and then into orbit within like a year and a half. That's what SDA has been pushing. And it's an ambitious goal already. And there's just been some delays in the launches, specifically because of the supply chain. It's first tranche, it's experimental, kind of like, can we do this? That was delayed because of COVID-19. And now as they prepare for tranche 1, which was supposed to go up, earlier, a couple months ago, last fall, that's been now pushed to March or April. And it's, again, supply chain, but this time it's the scale. It's, we've first they were doing like 10 or 12. Now it's 126, I think, that are on tranche 1. So it took time, I think, for the commercial industry and the primes, who each work with like dozens of subcontractors, to, get those items and be able to manufacture them at the pace with which SDA is kind of requiring. And moving forward, I think SDA has recognized that and is now trying to kind of extend that period of order to launch, just so that way they can give the industrial base time to ramp up production and scale with which what they need.
yeah, I think you raised an interesting point in this, excuse me, in this answer, because some problems, we were just discussing the budget, some problems can be solved just by throwing money at them. Others, if you're sourcing raw materials and building components, maybe not so much. I'll be interested to see what emerges in 2025 from commercial to bridge some of the demand for very large constellations, not only in the DoD, but Joey, as you were mentioning, the commercial architectures that are going up, and even, some of our peer competitor nations are putting up very large constellations as well. Want to pause here for any other thoughts from the panel before we move on?
Yeah, I just wanted to add very quickly that I think moving forward, it will not only, more time isn't going to be required, but I think a lot more communication between the Defense Department and commercial industry about, specific mission requirements and, getting those to industry as quickly as possible, because I feel like in a lot of cases, those have changed, which has then required, people to go back and redo some of the subcomponents. And I also will be interested to see, whether those primes begin to kind of rely more on commoditized systems as opposed to, very specific things, trying to figure out where can we buy off the shelf for, more baseline items comparatively.
And can I just jump in and say, I think something that's often overlooked, particularly with the large constellation question, is the question of access to spectrum. And that's going to affect both the DoD and the commercial companies in the United States, because this isn't a domestic issue. Well, it is a domestic issue with regards to, vying with the wireless industry for access to spectrum, but it's an international issue too. And there's another World Radio Conference in 2027. It sounds like a long time from now, but it's not. And there were a lot of issues left on the table from the last World Radio Conference. If people don't know what that is, that's a gathering of the membership leadership of the International Telecommunication Union, which essentially governs international use of spectrum. And spectrum is a finite asset. You can't stuff everybody who wants to broadcast cannot broadcast on the same frequency, or nobody will be able to broadcast. It'll be the Tower of Babel. So it's a regulated sphere. It's a finite resource. And there are a lot of unresolved potential conflicts over who gets access and is able to use that spectrum coming down the pike. And that's going to be a big issue for all of these constellations trying to fit themselves into low Earth orbit in particular.
Yeah, that's very true. Competition in more areas than just the hardware. For our next question, I would like to go back to NASA. Jeff, Trump has nominated Jarek Isaacman as for the role of the agency's administrator. And I know just this morning on Space News, you published a deep dive on him and his background and some outstanding questions. I've been following a lot of the coverage on Isaacman as well. Some folks call him a technocrat. Others praise him for his longstanding personal interest in space and aerospace. And I found that these reviews don't necessarily seem tied to political affiliation. If Isaacman is confirmed to the role, what do you believe his leadership would mean for NASA in 2025 and onward?
Yeah, I mean, that is sort of the fundamental question for NASA for the next 4 years is the leadership that it'll have and the direction it will take. And Jarek Isaacman is someone that obviously is a big promoter, big believer in commercial space capabilities, having flown to space twice. Through SpaceX and its Crew Dragon spacecraft. He's intimately familiar with those capabilities and what they can do. And I think it's logical to assume that he will try to take more advantage of those commercial capabilities at NASA as administrator. How that will take shape and what obstacles he will face remain to be seen. Certainly trying to rework or even discard Artemis in favor of a purely commercial architecture is going to run into a lot of roadblocks from sort of the established space industry and also members of Congress whose districts and states might be adversely affected by such a change. So that's something to keep in mind when you start to think about what sort of sweeping changes might be possible. But it's clear he's going to come in with a very different mindset. He's also going to come in without necessarily the intimate familiarity with the agency that some of its past administrators have had. He is definitely an outsider both to the agency and also to people on Capitol Hill he's going to be dealing with. So it'll be interesting to see who the administration decides to bring in as a deputy administrator who might be able to fill in some of those gaps, provide the insight in terms of both how the agency works and how its relationships with the Hill work to enable that. But certainly he is coming in as someone who's very commercially motivated, not necessarily a partisan person, as well. As it turns out, he's done a lot of campaign donations for Democrats in the last several years, which is an interesting fact that I found in doing reporting for that article. But he's going to be a change for the agency. The question is how much change and what direction.
I think your point about who will be the deputy admin is well taken, Jeff. Joey and Theresa, I see you're off mute as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I think, I agree with everything that Jeff says. And, Jared he seems open and he acknowledges that there are many other, launch providers and companies in the sector other than SpaceX, despite the fact that he was a big customer for SpaceX. So that was a promising signal for a lot of people in the industry. He made those comments, I think, at the Space Power Conference a few weeks ago. But, of course, he's going to face a lot of challenges, political challenges, but it's not just, Jared and NASA and the other stakeholders, members of Congress and the companies. It's also a challenge, I think, juggling
Okay, Theresa, did you have something as well? Okay. Well, the moment everyone's been waiting for, let's talk about Elon. I have a couple rapid fire questions lined up for the whole panel. And then I would also welcome observations or tidbits from the rest of you. I think the first thing that comes to mind here, it's no secret that Elon has become closer to the president than ever. And certainly there's been some speculation that this could result in SpaceX becoming unfairly advantaged in government contracting. I think, Joey, you touched on this a little above. But my question for you is, how valid are these concerns coming from the rest of the commercial ecosystem? And is there a role that maybe perception differs or differs from reality, or, what do we make of this?
I'll just start by saying, I think, there certainly is the perception that SpaceX could get favored in the incoming administration with Elon Musk so close to Trump, and how they're both talking a lot about going to Mars instead of the moon. It's not just Mars on top of the moon, but Elon has made clear that the moon is a distraction, which of course is not consistent with the current plan for NASA. There's a lot of politicking and fighting going on right now behind the scenes, as people in the audience might be aware of. And some sides are more vocal and more willing to be open about what they want, and some sides are not, of course. So I think, whether SpaceX gets favored by this administration, a lot is going to depend on what the other sides are doing and how effective they will be in pushing back on what people perceive as, a SpaceX agency, basically. But, that kind of remains to be seen what they're doing or how that is shaping up. But yeah.
Yeah, and sort of maybe build on what Joey is saying. We talk about the difference between perception and reality, but perception can be a reality all its own. And that's why, that so much of federal contracting law is built up to avoid even the perception of conflicts of interest. So that is going to be, any sort of challenge that the administration will face if it tries to do something like, end Artemis, redirect to Mars, that would appear to favor SpaceX. Of course, doing away with Artemis would also cancel a lot of contracts that SpaceX has for the Artemis, for the Starship version of the lunar lander, and support for the Gateway and things like that. So it's not necessarily entirely favoring SpaceX in going in that direction. But again, perception can take on a something of all on its own, regardless of what's really going on.
And I'll just add to that real quick. I mean, it's not just, switching up a program and then that's that. I mean, there are so many other contracts as well embedded in the Artemis program, like SLS. For all of the, political views on whether SLS should remain, there are contracts in place, and how you cancel those contracts is a very delicate legal situation that will, I think, inevitably have legal pushback in the courts if there's an attempt to cancel something. So I just wanted to plug that.
I just wanted to jump in and say that Musk's influence, the question of Musk's influence is not just one for domestic politics and NASA, but it's also a question for the international domain and diplomacy, not just space diplomacy, but foreign policy. And those issues have come up already, not just Ukraine, but questions in Germany, et cetera, and our relationship with the European Union and other allies in space commercial space, but also in the national security sphere. So there's a lot of questions revolving around what the new Doge group. I don't know whether to call it right now an agency or quite what department, or if it's an advisory group or what. But what influence it might also have in the national security sphere with regard to space and space activities, such as cooperative activities that have been going on at DoD. So it's a big question. Or maybe it's a lot of questions rather than just one question right now.
And I'll just add one other thought to that. I think, going back to the topic of international relations, I think, this administration obviously has an America First objective, and a pro-commercial, focus as well. And in space, I think, it's going to be more of a private diplomacy, like diplomacy in that how this can benefit our companies, like US companies, as opposed to how can we do space diplomacy for the sake of space diplomacy as we've done for decades. Not saying it's going to be one or the other, it could be both, but I think there's going to be more of a push for commercial diplomacy in ways that benefit companies like SpaceX or Blue Origin. And if the Artemis program is changed to go directly to Mars, Blue Origin, I think, could also be equipped to handle that task as well. I talked to Jeff last 2 weeks ago, as some other reporters did ahead of the New Glenn launch, and he said that Blue Moon can be changed and outfitted with the right tools to get to Mars instead, if that policy decision is made. Of course, that leaves uncertain what the countries and what the U.S. allies are going to do in that case, because they're heavily tied into the Moon program as well. Not just the Artemis Accords, of course, but the actual programmatic partners. UAE is building an airlock. ESA has a role in Gateway. A lot of other countries, of course, are involved. So that kind of all gets reshuffled somehow if we pivot to the Moon.
I think the turn of phrase that you just used, Joey, commercial diplomacy, is very interesting to me. And given we are the Washington Space Business Roundtable here, I hope it's interesting to the folks listening to the webinar today. I want to talk a little bit more about this Moon versus Mars dichotomy that has emerged in recent weeks. As you were mentioning, the difficulty of canceling existing contracts, and if so much momentum is already in place for the Artemis missions as currently envisioned, Moon first and then later to Mars, what would a pivot such as what has been discussed in recent weeks, skipping the Moon and going to Mars, what would it realistically mean for companies that contribute to the Artemis missions or are on contract to provide products and services to the government for these missions? Trump even verbalized support for going to Mars in the next 4 years in his inaugural address. My question is, what are the downstream effects of these high-level discussions on businesses in the U.S. and the national capital area?
A lot to unpack there, but go ahead, Jeff. Sorry.
I could have broken it into multiple questions for you.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of companies right now that have contracts to support Artemis that might wonder what will happen to those contracts if there is a pivot. I am personally a little skeptical that there would be such a hard break from the Moon to Mars because, one, it would face a lot of obstacles in Congress from members, including key appropriators that are, have companies, districts, organizations that are involved with Artemis in some way. Another is geopolitics. If we were to give up on the Moon effectively and try and go directly to Mars, we would be in danger of looking like we were ceding Moon rather to China, and that would not necessarily be a great look for the U.S. on the geopolitical stage. And then there's also the issue of, we can talk about going to Mars, but getting humans there is something really just impossible in the next 4 years. We could start on it right now, and it seems extremely unlikely that we would have everything in place to have humans setting foot on the Martian surface before January 20th of 2029. So it'd be a next administration or a future administration down the road that would actually be taking credit for that. So I think there's a lot of factors there that would suggest that while there may be a greater emphasis on Mars, I'm not convinced that would mean giving up on the moon entirely.
Yeah. And I mean, the Mars has always been a quiet part of the Artemis moon program, right? That's been the ultimate destination. And I've tried talking to Republican lawmakers who would be affected by a change in this, or who would maybe push back on this. And, they don't have a lot to say, but I think I saw Ted Cruz, for example, in some video or a press conference, I can't remember, maybe this week or last week, he was saying that, he seems supportive of the Mars rhetoric that's coming out of Trump and Elon. But I think he kind of like walked the line of, I think what a lot of people are doing when they're kind of agreeing with the Mars objective is they're trying to delicately acknowledge that, yes, Mars as a part of the Artemis program, as opposed to Mars as this new objective for the Trump administration that ditches the moon entirely. But yeah, I think it's going to be interesting, and if we do ultimately end up focusing on only Mars and landing humans on Mars, as Jeff said, I think that's extremely unlikely to do in the next 4 years. And given that, then what is the value for Trump in the next 4 years in focusing on Mars when we've already landed there many times with probes and rovers, whereas the moon has more potential to have a moon base that, as NASA has right now in its policy, to use as a stepping stone to go to Mars. So it depends how loud Elon will be in Trump's ear on this, and how that will compete with the whole other chorus of everyone else from the industry trying to urge Trump to stay course on Artemis.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you guys for all the discussion so far on the questions I had lined up. I want to go to audience Q&A now. We actually have a lot more time remaining than I anticipated. I will say, Sunny, I have not been tracking the audience Q&A, so if you have some, really great questions queued up, would you be willing to just read off the first of those for us? If not, I can take a moment to scroll through. Or I guess to our panelists as well. If a question from the chat really jumps out at you, let's go ahead and get into it.
From Kate that is asking how to resolve the disconnect between what drives commercial companies and what is needed for a national security strategy.
You mean beyond budget? Are you talking beyond the budgetary questions? Is that the issue here?
Yes,
I mean,
beyond funding.
Okay. Well, there are also problems within DoD with regards to classification that the DoD has been trying to fix, but which haven't necessarily yet been fixed. There have been some policy decisions about trying to not totally declassify, but lower the classification levels of space programs, space development programs, in particular acquisition and development programs, so as to be able to share more information about DoD's requirements, et cetera, with the commercial industry. Those haven't really quite kicked in yet all the way down the food chain in DoD. So that's an issue that could be worked on to try to help resolve disconnects. Mikayla mentioned better communication, and that would at least be step one, better communication about what actually DoD wants. I think there's another problem within DoD and one that was supposed to be addressed, I think, by the Space Force, but maybe hasn't quite been. There was some consolidation under Frank Calvelli of some of the different pieces of the acquisition pie for space. So he was the first, space acquisition executive in the DoD. Interestingly, if you actually read the legislation, it set up the concept of space acquisition executive across the Department of Defense. The way it was established within the Department of Defense was as the Air Force acquisition executive for space. Okay. So Calvelli's shop did not come in control of all of the places where space capabilities are acquired. Space capabilities are still acquired by the services, primarily the Army and the Navy as well. But then there's the Missile Defense Agency. There's, the intelligence agencies that also have acquisition authorities. Now, I'm not advocating here that everything should be brought under the Space Force. That's not my job. And there are pros and cons about that concept, but there doesn't seem still to be a good, solid place where there is oversight or someone with power to make sure that all these acquisition elements and acquisition programs are on the same track. And thus you've gotten some disconnects between the intelligence community, for example, and the Space Force about who gets to buy what, when. And that has also confused the commercial industry. And so there are policy issues as well as budgetary issues. There are governance issues that has to do to go back to the Biden administration's efforts to try to get some of the governance issues, like who's in control of regulating new space activities, the authorization for oversight of those activities that also remain unresolved. So there are policy governance questions as well as budgetary questions, making it for a really complicated issue. So there isn't like a silver bullet to fix this. It's a lot of different loose ends that need to be attacked, if you will, or and people need to work on each of those loose ends to try to tie them up.
If only there was a silver bullet for questions.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to add on to something that Theresa said about the classification issues. And I just wanted to add, I think that this is something that DoD recognizes that commercial industry wants is information, because part of the CASA program that we mentioned earlier, they have incentives for, besides money as to why commercial should get on board with this. And one of them is information and threat sharing. And, that's something that from my conversations with commercial industry, they're really, intrigued about, and they want that, so that way they know, what their satellites would be up against, or what's coming down the line, like what are their things. So I think that that is something that DoD is cognizant that commercial industry wants. It's just, like you mentioned, Theresa, the actual actionable items to get it done, and going through all the classification spider webs and getting things like that too.
Alex, do you want me to continue to curate some of the questions?
Yeah, Courtney, why don't you go ahead and parse the audience Q&A?
Let me just say I've been getting texts from people who are really finding the discussion very illuminating. So thank you all. Not surprised. Soraya Fisher, member of our WSBR family, asks, do you mind breaking down further the other members of Congress or the incoming administration with a vested interest in Moon to Mars, and who stands to be more vocal than others pushing back against a hard break from Artemis?
First thing that comes to mind for me is, well, as I said before, I've tried getting in touch with a lot of as a reporter, so there are limits to that, I guess, but I've tried getting in touch with a lot of the Republican lawmakers in Alabama and Texas who have a direct stake in this, of course. They're not saying much. Except Tommy Tuberville from Alabama. He had a statement a few weeks ago, or maybe more than a month ago, where he said something like he was just playing down the threats to SLS. SLS is going to stay. And he acknowledged that there's concern about Musk's proximity to Trump and how that might spell the end of SLS. But he was basically saying that, no, I don't think that's going to happen. Everything is going to be fine. I don't, you can interpret that a number of ways. And again, that was a month ago and a lot has changed since then. But, that's kind of a lot of what I've got so far from the Republicans on this.
Yeah, I mean, point out, there are members who either have companies or NASA centers in their districts that have influential roles Brian Babin is now the chairman of the House Science Committee. He used to be chair of the Space Subcommittee. His Houston area district includes JSC. So he's definitely going to be a player in terms of any sort of authorizing legislation that might reaffirm or change Artemis in some way. And I thought it was noteworthy that the vice chair of the CJS, Commerce, Justice, and Science Subcommittee, the House Appropriations Committee, is Dale Strong, who's from the Huntsville area, so it includes Marshall. So, you know, it's sometimes watching the purse strings is the key thing to keep an eye out for in terms of what is going to be happening in terms of policy here, even more so than any sort of authorizing efforts. So certainly he's going to play a role. Also, Glenn Ivey is on the Democratic side, is on that same subcommittee as well. His district includes Goddard. So if there are any threats to Goddard programs or to Goddard itself by the new administration, he's certainly going to play a role there. So those are people to keep an eye out on in terms of what roles they will have and what they will have to say about any sort of changes this administration wants to make to the agency and its programs.
That's great.
Thanks, Joey.
Alex,
Thanks, Jeff.
anybody
Hi,
else, or should we move on? Oh, go ahead, Soraya.
Just saying thank you. That was good context. Appreciate you guys
Yeah.
speaking today.
Great. Yeah, thank you for your great question. Alex, may I move on?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to, if you don't
Yeah,
mind,
of
I wanted
course.
to go to Victoria Sampson's question. Just
That,
as
that was my next question. Go ahead. Absolutely.
great. Aligns with something we discussed as a team before the panel. Victoria asks, what is the panel's thoughts on statements by USG officials about the need for offensive weapons to be placed in space and, quote, responsible counter space campaigning? How does the US ensure it doesn't trash the environment in which it needs to operate?
I'll start with that, since that's something I've been following for a very long time and in a number of my jobs in the past. The first thing is, up to now, at least in the Biden administration, there was an administration pledge, and we even put this to the United Nations. We have, have had votes on a resolution there sponsored by the United States, for countries to refrain from using missiles launched, ground launch missiles that would destroy satellites in space and create space debris. Space debris is currently a big environmental hazard, and it's getting bigger by the second. Space is big, but the parts of space that are usable are not as big, and they are getting more crowded. And every time you put something in space, you create some little bit of space debris. So that is a growing problem. It's a classic environmental problem. No one wants to take responsibility for it. It's huge. It threatens to become a tragedy of the commons, but the U.S. had taken a pretty strong stance against the creation of space debris, including by military forces. Whether that, however, was a Biden administration decision, it's not a legal treaty. It's not wasn't a vote by Congress, so that can be undone. That's going to be a question, I guess, as we go forward. The one, the question of weapons in space has long been a controversial one here domestically. It goes back a long way, and on the international stage, I think. The thing that the United States has to be really careful about in this policy is be careful what you wish for, because whatever the U.S. does will be copied by its adversaries. And that's the first thing. The second thing is there needs to be a lot more thought about the nexus between the military and commercial companies providing services that are essentially military actions. For example, there are companies currently who have in their prospects hunting down and killing satellites on orbit. That raises a whole lot of international legal questions, but it also raises the specter that adversaries will then decide that anything that the United States has put into orbit is a weapon and thus targetable. And the Russians have made noise about that already with regard to Starlink. And this gets back to Geneva Conventions and international law, and no matter what the United States government may think about its obligations in international law, other countries have opinions and policies about that as well. And so there are potential repercussions with regards to a heavily offensive strategy that includes weapons in space, depending on how you do it. And again, I'm not here to advocate one way or the other. I'm just saying that I don't believe that the thought has been given to the potential second and third order consequences of those activities. And that has to be done, I think, for a national security strategy involving offensive weapons placed in space before actions are taken that have negative repercussions. And so, to me, I think there needs to be some serious policy and doctrinal exploration of what exactly the military wants to do, what the potential repercussions are, and how you handle those repercussions if they happen. And lastly, how do you de-escalate in a conflict, given that there are weapons based on orbit?
I just want to, I mean, Theresa, you're the master on that topic, so I guess I'll just try to add a little bit to it. I think, I sometimes assume that there are already offensive weapons in space, US weapons, and that a deterrence strategy is not exactly to use them and or necessarily to launch them into space, but to reveal their existence in space. And I think, that might seem obvious, but I think it'll just ratchet up the kind of security dilemma in space and might lead to more discussions about international norms in orbit. I think, one interesting discussion on that is the application of international humanitarian law and how, can private companies be involved in this offensive space warfare? And if they are, then are those companies that also have civilian satellites? And I think those are discussions that space military lawyers are currently trying to kind of flesh out right now. And one other thing I'll just say is that, when we were talking about the Artemis Accords before, one other kind of threat to the continuation of the Artemis Accords is this offensive military space strategy. Because if you're advocating for weapons that would kind of go against the principles of the Artemis Accords, it would be hard for the US to maintain both of those voices, I think. And so I've just heard some speculation that one of the reasons that the Artemis Accords might not continue is because of an emphasis on the space military aspect of the US space enterprise instead of the international diplomacy, ally courting kind of efforts.
Yeah. Joe, you are absolutely right about assuming that there are already some sort of, weapons, if you will, in space. I would not necessarily assume they are kinetic, but or debris creating. But the point is that, the U.S., and I'm not advocating for necessarily the U.S. to lie about its, its posture. But again, there needs to be some strategic thought processes around what is revealed, if anything is revealed, what is newly placed on orbit, if anything, for what purposes, for what missions, and with full knowledge of what the possible reactions of adversaries might be, as well as reactions of allies, partners, and friends. And yeah. I haven't seen that kind of thinking, at least in the public domain. Perhaps it's happening behind the scenes at DoD or at the National Security Council, but if it has, it's not in the public domain and it hasn't been discussed.
Yeah. And
now
actually,
let's move on, go ahead.
One other quick thing I wanted to say is that, I think also space tracking and space surveillance plays a major role in all this discussion. Of course, seeing what enemies are doing in space is a major, source of intelligence for forming these ideas, these policies, these legal rationales. And if we're just talking about what we're going to expect in the next year or 2 years or under the Trump administration, I think actually that might be a really interesting field to watch, is the growth of the space tracking industry and the advances in technology and our ability to see what's out there, what's moving. I think, a lot of it is classified, a lot of capabilities there are classified, or the intelligence that it's gathering is classified. But I think with the rise in innovation and the increase in commercial players in that domain, declassification maybe, or just transparency in that field is inevitable, I think. Both from that deterrence perspective, but also just because of the natural need to see what's going on in space and the technologies that are being developed in that area in the commercial sector.
Yeah, and you talking about that, Joey, and then Theresa, when we're talking about debris, I just have been thinking about kind of what kind of growth in technologies like artificial intelligence and data management, are going to kind of be used in these applications too. Not even just like for the debris question, but just like the growing in number and tracking and ISR capabilities, and how much of that comes from commercial, how much of that comes from DoD, what are the limits of that capability, and how much it'll grow. I think it's another really interesting thing to look at too, especially. It's already being done a little bit, but I think it's only going to get even, more proliferated with technology.
Yeah, and one final point here. This is also the year that we see the traffic coordination system for space, take over. It's in beta testing now. It's supposed to, by the end of the fiscal year, be really sort of up and running in at least its phase 1 iteration. This is a major milestone in handing over the space traffic coordination responsibilities from DoD to Commerce. And we'll see how well that works and what sort of capabilities Track can provide that maybe the Space Force doesn't or can't do now, just as we see this explosion in the growth of space objects. So that's a key thing to keep an eye out for this year.
Alex, I can see why we wanted to have that question asked. This extraordinarily important and very informative exchange. And just a shout out to Victoria Sampson, who asked the question. She's a great friend of WSBR and, in my humble opinion, one of the best analysts on this topic at Secure World Foundation. So thank you, Victoria. I know we're running the clock out here, but Chris Cummins asks, will any moon program become more like a commercial cargo, commercial crew, or a commercial LEO destination program with international participation with the incoming administration? And anybody wish to opine on that?
I mean, that's a possibility. The thing is that what made commercial cargo, commercial crew so successful is that there were other markets for these capabilities. SpaceX used commercial cargo to bring Falcon 9 online, and now Falcon 9 is the world's leading launch vehicle. Orbital now Northrop has used the Cygnus spacecraft to serve other applications as well, such as for the Lunar Gateway. And obviously, we've seen what SpaceX has done with commercial crew in terms of finding other customers, particularly for the commercial space stations. The issue is for a commercial lunar program, beyond sort of what we've seen with the CLIPS program for robotic missions, is who are the customers going to be? Are there sufficient international government customers or potentially commercial customers for a commercial crewed lunar program to be able to support that in the same way to ensure success like we've seen in commercial cargo or crew? I'm not sure really at this point. We're certainly seeing the commercial space station people, working hard to try and build up a business case that involves NASA, but also other governments in the commercial sector. And that's sort of a big challenge for them. Lunar is going to be an even bigger challenge, but the possibility may be open.
All right. I know we're at 12:59 mark, but if I may take the prerogative of the president, let me ask one more question, Alex, and then with the panel's permission and the audience, we may bleed a few minutes past 1 o'clock. And I'll make my concluding remarks very quick. But I've got to ask my friend of 40 years, Jeff Troberman. He asked, is the Artemis program actually in conflict with the desire to land humans on Mars? Or is there an argument for Artemis being a potential stepping stone for human landing on Mars? I know you've touched on it, but if anyone wants to address that explicitly.
I mean, that's what NASA has really been arguing with this whole moon to Mars architecture, that Artemis is fulfilling the first parts of that approach of going back to the moon and building up capabilities and then going on to Mars. The question is, will the administration try and alter that architecture and perhaps de-emphasize the moon or cut it out entirely to go to Mars? But I mean, there's certainly an argument to be made, and one that NASA has been making, that the moon is a stepping stone to Mars. The question is, how long do you want to stay on that stepping stone before going on to Mars?
Yeah.
Alex, any concluding comments, or if you want to do your thing for a moment or so, and then I can come in behind you.
I don't know that I have anything else to say. Just thank you all for being such an engaging panel today. I think we covered a pretty wide range and appreciate the focus looking ahead to 2025. You know, this was a virtual event, WSBR's first event of the year, but looking forward to being back in person for our regular luncheons as early as next month. And so I'll pass it to you, Courtney.
All right. And I do want to thank you, Alex. You, as I knew you would, you just knocked it out of the park, and thank you so much. And if I may say to all of our panelists, on behalf of our community, thank you for the work you do every day, you and your colleagues, because you really are the glue, frankly, that keeps our community updated and informed. And the shoe leather and the block and tackle you do every day really is very appreciated by all of us. So thank you. My concluding comment is, as Alex said at the beginning, we are a volunteer organization, about 30 some odd years old, and the bulk of our donations go to help underserved students in the mostly nation's capital, although I've been trying to broaden our footprint a bit to help those wonderful teachers and students who ultimately go in, we hope, into technical related fields. And even if they dare become lawyers, at least have some STEM background behind them. So we thank you. Secondly, we're always looking for volunteers. So please, if any of you are interested in learning more about WSBR, you're welcome to our recently revamped website, and be happy to answer any questions that you all may have. The next in-person event is February 4th. It's a Tuesday, and it's on a very, very timely issue of cybersecurity in space. And we're honored to have a senior executive from Deloitte, which has carved out a real specialty expertise in that area. And we have a senior official from NIST, and there are a couple of other speakers that we're focusing on. But it's going to be on security, cybersecurity in space. That's a big issue for this incoming administration. And I hope that all of you will, who are listening, are available in the Washington area. It'll be at Hogan and Lovell at 555 13th Street. It's on our website. I've timed it. It takes you literally 2 minutes or less to register. It's a wonderful networking opportunity. In fact, I've witnessed business deals made at our events. And we really hope you all can sign up for it in February 4th. So with that, thank you, all of you who tuned in, for your time, and the panelists for carving out a precious hour plus from your time. And Alex, I'm sorry you did such a great job. We'll probably punish you in the future, having you moderate and be part of these in the future. And I want to thank GA team, my Vice President, Seamus Kane, and everyone for making this possible. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you, guys.
You got it. Thanks.
Good to see you all.
Bye.